Hi, everyone. Brad Porter here with my weekly Sunday update. This week, I'm going to talk about biases and blind spots. And so, when I took on robotics at Amazon in 2017, uh, one of the things we felt like we had a blind spot on is where is China at in logistics, right? Where were Alibaba and where were these companies in automating? Was Amazon way behind or not? And so we did a bunch to try to just calibrate, to try to like get exposure into to avoid that blind spot. One of the things we did was we used a news clipping service that helped us find articles that were untranslated to the West but publicly available that we could gain insight into where was China? Where was this investment going? In 2019, I went to Shanghai. I went to a huge, million plus square foot conference to understand where everything was at. And I got a lot more insight into it. Anyhow, I was reminded of this week because I still do this. I still kind of try to tap into news sources from China, follow things that are going on, just to get that diversity of perspective. So one of the things I found fascinating is I read the Q1 investor report from Pony AI. Now, interesting, Western audience, people may not know who Pony AI is, but they're one of the top autonomous vehicle AI companies in the world, and a very large one in China. And they were doing their investor update and report, and it was fascinating because they talked about the challenges of imitation learning, and I have talked also about the challenges of imitation learning, but to some extent it's two different perspectives. So it was fascinating to read their take on the challenges of imitation learning as it applies to self-driving and to get another perspective. But it's also interesting in that perspective that Pony AI was bringing, and I think to some extent the perspective I'm bringing is a little different than the current kind of Silicon Valley narrative that Tesla has this huge advantage because they have all this driving data. It was interesting because Pony AI was also talking about LiDAR and the innovations they're needing to do in LiDAR and how to bring that data together. I think there is a bias that like LiDAR is really, really important for really safe operation. And so, we think about these biases and blind spots, right? The reason I think, that Tesla may not have LiDAR. I remember the debates in kind of 2014 as to whether you could do everything with vision. Obviously, humans do everything with vision. Can you do everything with vision? Well, it ends up being a little bit of a blind spot if you kind of just take like a philosophical bias and don't test it against reality. I also had the chance this week to play with ByteDance's ChatGPT variant, right? And this isn't Western exposed. I happen to have the chance to try it out quickly, and it was I asked it about physical AI. I asked it about and I asked about imitation learning. I asked about I said, hey, there's debate about whether imitation learning has real promise or not. And what was fascinating was that this large language model steered me in a very different direction with respect to which techniques might be most appropriate. It actually steered me toward this technique that's known and talked about of kind of making it more object-centric learning and manipulation. Instead of manipulator-centric, make it more object-centric. This has been an area that the U.S. has studied, but it's not an area that we're necessarily talking about that much right now. And it was fascinating that if you're in China and you're using language models like this to learn about which techniques or to kind of be inspired about which techniques might be used, you're going to get a different set of guidance, a different set of direction than you do from, say, ChatGPT. And so, again, there are all these kind of biases and blind spots that we have. I talked to an engineer on my team this week because I felt like, hey, maybe like, do I really know what's going on kind of at the lower levels of the software organization, how they're thinking about things? And it was great. It was a great conversation. Obviously, I have an incredible team. But in that conversation, I realized that certain messages that we were trying to communicate, that I was trying to communicate broadly across the company, were not reaching him. So, to some extent, it's a blind spot from my standpoint that the messages aren't getting through, but maybe the team has biases or blind spots as well. And so, as a leader, a lot of our job is like, where do we have these blind spots? how do we build mechanisms to to try to identify them, try to correct for them, and then just how do we like constantly think about our internal biases. Um, and so that's what I've been thinking about a lot this week, and what I wanted to summarize. I'm also going to take a minute and just give an update on kind of the podcast, newsletter, how all that's going. So what's fascinating about putting the podcast out is that people consume it not in a weekly serial, but they consume it based on which topic's most interesting. So what's fascinating is that the leaderboard right now is tied between my like hot take on humanoids and my discussion of upgrading my feet. Um, I find it eminently amusing that you guys are all very interested in my feet journey. But let me give you an update on that, because I actually the reason we put that episode out quickly is because I actually do get a lot of questions about that episode and like how it's going with like and so I'll show you. I'll back up here. I've got my I bought a second pair of Ultras. I'm really enjoying these shoes. It is interesting. I have actually noticed that I have more kind of lateral stability control. I have more like individual control of my toes. And actually, I'm not going to show before and after pictures on the internet, but like I do notice the kind of fifth metatarsal is kind of rotating back out, flattening back out a little bit. And so anyhow, if you haven't looked into Ultra shoes, like you should look into it. I also have like a cork rollerball that I really like. And so that's been great. The newsletter is now 5,300 subscribers. People are tuning in every week. That's exciting. I think over 350 downloads of the podcast in the first week. And so, content's getting out there. We're really just trying to educate everyone about, again, there's a lot of blind spots, a lot of biases around robotics. And if we can kind of bring those out, anyhow, subscribe to the newsletter, tune into the podcast. A little longer than normal because I want to give an update on both things. But hope you're all doing well and have a great Sunday.